welcome you all into our Centering Equity Workshop series. My name is Tiana Lyons-King, and I am CAM's Community Engagement Manager. Thank you all again for taking the time to join us today in our last session for this series, Cultural Equity is a Human Right. As we begin this event, we'd like to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. California is home to over 150 tribes, and an acknowledgement is just one step towards working with Native communities to build meaningful relationships. Museums and many institutions were founded upon purposeful exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples and still benefit from settler colonialism and associated harms. CAM is committed to moving beyond land acknowledgements and into action. We encourage you to learn more about the tribes in your areas and find ways to celebrate and support them. I reside in San Diego, California, which means I'm on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay people. I encourage you to check out nativeland.ca. It's a helpful but not definitive resource for you all to learn more about the tribes in your area. I will put that in the chat for your convenience. And with that, I'm really excited to get things going today. Before we do that, just a few housekeeping, same things as usual. Just so you're aware, this workshop will be recorded and will be posted to CAM's YouTube channel. Registrants will receive a link via email once it is uploaded. Our workshops are a space for learning and collaboration. We ask that you respect yourself and others in the room. The chat box will be open. You can use the chat box to ask questions if you'd like to. There will be points throughout the session where Yvonne will encourage you to come off of mute and turn on your video to have really candid and honest conversations. You'll also be able to ask the questions in that moment. If you have a question that you'd like to ask in an anonymous way, you can always message me through the chat box, or you can send me email at engagement@calmuseums.org. You can also send me a message if you're having tech issues or anything of that sort. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Yvonne. Yvonne, the floor is yours. And thank you all again for joining us. I'll be off camera, muted, but I am here if you all need me.
Thanks so much, Tiana. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you today. And for those who are here for the first time, welcome. We'll be doing an overview of what we covered in our first two sessions, and really looking forward to the time we have together today to share stories in an effort towards collective knowledge sharing. That is how we learn and advance cultural equity best, in my opinion. But let's get started. We have somewhat a lot to cover, and in order to make space for our storytelling. If you haven't done so already, I'd love to invite you to place your name, your role, and your organization or institution in the chat so that we just know who all is in the house. And with that, I'm going to share screen. So over the past two sessions, we have been exploring this idea, this term, this very important concept of cultural equity. We acknowledge that while the commitment of advancing cultural equity in our arts and culture institutions certainly can be viewed as the right thing to do, moreover, it's important to understand that this is critical to any institution's relevance moving forward. This session will provide a summary review of, again, our previous sessions, and then introduce some of the issues more specifically to museums that are currently playing out as it relates to cultural equity. And one question is, how are rapid culture and demographic shifts across our country and the world significantly impacting the way museums operate, program, and even collect? So let's get into it. So we talked about what we'll explore, our time together, And before we get into it, I just want to take a moment, not just for myself, but also invite everyone just to take a beat. I think everyone is experiencing holiday rush and a lot of work and communication flying around. And certainly we are all committed and dedicated to that work, but we need to also practice what I like to share as collective and personal grief of what's happening in the world around us. I want to acknowledge that as we continue our work, as we meet our deadlines, as we do the very important work in our arts and culture institutions, that there is life happening. There are world events happening. And it is an honor and a privilege to be able to gather together with you today, considering that context, to strengthen connection, to provide healing or clarity in some cases, to mark significant moments, and to remember and practice gratitude. So it's an honor to do that with you all together today. And I invite you to just breathe if necessary, and it is necessary, but breathe a little more intentionally as we move through our time together. So what we have talked a lot about over the past couple of sessions is this concept of cultural equity. And I call it a concept because there is no one definition of cultural equity. And most of the field's discussions have taken place at a highly theoretical or conceptual level, leaving many of us to ponder, explore, continue to learn about how it shows up in our day-to-day work. We're all decision makers. Wherever area you work in within your museum or your institution, we are all making decisions that affect not only the offers of your institution or museum, but also affect the lives of others. So how do we develop greater understanding of how cultural equity shows up in our day-to-day? This series aims to do that, and we're going to talk more in depth about that today. So like concepts of equality and equity, which we've talked a lot about within our field, cultural equity and our understanding of it continues to grow and expand. We're asking better questions. We're being introduced to expanding needs within our field and how they intersect. This idea that everyone has the right to art, culture, and cultural expressions. And so cultural equity in its like other equity lanes, other equity efforts, racial equity, equity broadly speaking, accessibility and inclusion. Cultural equity, like those, calls for a dismantling of discriminatory systems of all forms, anything that is creating a barrier to fully participating in arts and culture. It addresses the history in the US of the homogeneity of arts and cultural institutions, content, staff, and leadership. So cultural equity lives in a justice lane, much like racial equity, ability justice, gender justice, etc. So while cultural equity is a conversation that is rooted in, but not exclusively about race, race is an undeniably important to the work of justice in the US. So we take into account other aspects of identity and community infrastructure in subtle and distinct ways as we advance our cultural equity work. So one example we shared as to a cultural equity definition or statement would be more appropriate is from Americans for the Arts, which states that cultural equity ensures that all people are represented in the development of arts policy, the support of artists, the nurturing of accessible, thriving venues for expression, and the fair distribution of programmatic, financial, and informational resources. Cultural equity is critical to the long-term viability of our arts sector. We also understand that we must hold ourselves accountable to the commitments that we make to advance cultural equity, because acknowledging and challenging our inequities and working in partnership is how we make change happen. So if everyone deserves equal access to a full, vibrant, creative life, which is essential to a healthy and democratic society, then how are we holding ourselves accountable to the commitment to advance that? Certainly, the prominent presence of artists is critical as they challenge inequities and encourage alternatives. And as we work within institutions and organizations that are often focused on objects, we have to remind ourselves of the people in the work. And certainly that includes artists. So we also talked a bit about what are the critical issues that are impacting arts and culture, and will be for the next 10 years. We know that Americans for the Arts put forth the following as critical trends. I don't know if they're trends, but they're critical commitments, critical callings, right, to the work. Forecasting is a tricky business. I just had a conversation with someone, and we were talking about the economy, and everyone is sort of in this standstill about what can we expect from the economy in the next couple of years. And so we understand that things change, things pivot, sometimes quickly and sometimes unexpectedly. So just a few of these, social justice movements will continue, as we clearly can see at the moment. We will continue to reckon with historic and current racial inequities. The plight of independent creative workers will become a focus as we understand economic inequities that continue to persist, specifically within our field. Like it or not, digital is here to stay. I know this idea of getting back out there was a very exciting thing at the moment, but we're now understanding that there is a greater culture shift that happened with regard to in-person events, right? Where before no one second guessed it, they just kind of up and went. Now there is a consideration: do I really want to go to this in-person event? And so it's going to take a while. As we took 3 years to develop new habits, it will take a while to sort of settle into what is this new normal. We also talked about the fact that because cultural equity lives in a justice lane, it certainly moves along and oftentimes intersects other change work lanes, as we spoke about. Equity, broadly speaking, racial equity, cultural equity is right there, aligned and along the same lane. And certainly inclusion, this broader idea of an individual fully participating, contributing their best efforts, and having the best experience with the least amount of barriers and aggravations. All of the change work lanes oftentimes move alongside each other, but certainly as we do cultural equity work and we think about how to do it, we want to understand where the overlaps and the intersections happen with other change work lanes. We learned a little bit about the work of Create Equity, which was a think tank developed in 2015 and is now sunsetted, but you can access their website at createequity.org, I believe. They put forth, based on research and a lot of discussions with arts and culture institutions, organizations, artists, etc., they put forth 4 visions for cultural equity. This gets us from that highly conceptual, there's no one definition place, and into a more strategic framework. And so those 4 visions for cultural equity include diversity, prosperity, redistribution, and self-determination. And what we understood is that as you move through each of these visions, diversity to prosperity, to redistribution, to self-determination, not that the work happens in that order, but as you see the visions expand, you see a greater distance or gap between the status quo and where we find ourselves in self-determination, which is it's less about assimilating or conforming to an existing status quo and more about creating something new or creating a different or shifting the ecosystem, if you will, as we consider our arts and culture field an ecosystem. And so we can see that while diversity has diversity oftentimes focuses on audiences, programming, and then finally on leadership. We can see that prosperity, redistribution, and self-determination have different approaches to the equity goal. So what we saw between 2020 and 2022 was a heightened sense of urgency, not only as a result of everyone being, a stay-at-home situation, but also because of the rising Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd. There was a compounding evidence of compounding issues that had long been present in our communities, being really put into focus for us. And, we were in a moment where we were allowed to focus, or forced rather to focus. So cultural institutions around the country really responded. Some reacted, some responded to this moment and calls from both internal staff members as well as external stakeholders for some type of action. And much of the action centered around the diversity framework that create equity presented among the four visions, the diversity vision. And so we saw the hiring of diversity officers to increase the number of people of color on staff, within staff and board. We also saw efforts to broaden programming, to diversify programming. And also, we saw a flurry of statements that acknowledged the context in which museums, institutions, and organizations operated in, namely, patterns of systemic racism that were part of our country's history. But we knew for a while that our field, particularly museums, lacked diversity at some of the higher within higher staff positions, so middle management, executive management, and certainly board membership, because the Mellon Foundation had released reports on diversity within museums back in 2015, then followed up with 2017, and I think the latest one was 2022. I might be skipping one. And what it showed in 2015 is we certainly lacked diversity within these positions, these middle management and higher level positions. We saw in 2017 that the needle did not move, maybe a little, very slight. And then most recently, we've seen that the needle moved a little bit, but nowhere near where we need to be. So if we knew this information about our field already, what was we can ask ourselves, why now? Why is it in focus now? And what can we learn from the past about what worked, what didn't work? Every cultural equity effort within an institution or museum has a history to it. There's a history of efforts, whether it was in the 80s and 90s, multiculturalism, or more recently, the effort to diversify audiences, diversify programming. There's been attempts along the way, and it's important for museums and your institutions to try to, if you don't already have that story or that history documented, how might you undergo an effort to do just that? Because creating solutions in a vacuum is not going to serve anyone. It's certainly not what would be a smart way to approach change work in your institution. And also, there may have been efforts that worked in the past, and also attempts at change that just failed miserably. And we want to learn from that history. And we also want to understand that history so that when we communicate our change work to the public, to stakeholders, to board members, to artists, that we can confidently say, we're not new to this rodeo, right? We've been doing the work. Here's how it worked in the past. Here's how it didn't. And so we're persistent, right? We're persisting in this work. We're committed to this work, which I know many of your museums and institutions are. So we want to understand that the message of change and actual change are two very different things. And we want to hold ourselves, I always say, I believe accountability is love. Right? We hold each other accountable in love. And so how can we hold ourselves accountable to what we said we would do? Whether it was in 2022 or, well before that. So Art News published an article in September of 2022 that stated substantial increases in diversity were made in museum departments, including security facilities and education departments, which are historically overrepresented by people of color and which saw the greatest job losses as a result of COVID-19. However, participating museums reported that they have dramatically increased staffing in all of these areas since 2022. I having been in the arts and culture field my entire career, I'm very lucky to say that, and to start my career in a museum where I learned everything that I know about our field. And I've also experienced as a consultant working across many spaces, many disciplines. Our field tends to engage sometimes in unhealthy over-optimism. I don't know if you agree, but I've seen that happen. Sometimes there's a bit of navel gazing. We're human. We understand that sometimes we have blinders when it comes to our work, or we think that we are doing that our work is unchallenged, or our work is wonderful. And I think it's an and, not an or, but it's very important with regard to equity or change work that we understand very clearly what our commitments or goals are, what we're committed to increasing, or how we're moving the needle, and then what we're doing to hold ourselves accountable. This isn't a race to the finish line. We all understand that this work must be sustainable. It's ongoing. And so it's not about delivering something quick and fast. It's about how are we holding ourselves accountable to those commitments? How are we looking at our work and our cultural equity work clearly? Are we sharing our work? Are we inviting input? Are we sharing that process and that journey with our stakeholders, so that we're not thinking as outsiders looking at your museum or institution like, well, I heard they were committed to cultural equity or diversity, equity, inclusion, but I haven't heard much lately. There's a lot of that, I think, happening in the moment. And so it's important at the moment to really align kind of, what your actions are with what your thoughts and your words are about the work. So we know that cultural equity work within museums has been taking place in regards to leadership, staff, collections, interpretations, exhibitions, digital content, education, and public programs, just to name a few functional areas of museum and institutional work. We also know that operationalizing cultural equity, just like any change work, happens at a systemic, personal, and organizational level, not methodic, not, first the systemic, then the personal, et cetera, et cetera. It's all happening congruently. It's all happening alongside of each other, and that it requires this shift for more sustained, impactful change. And so cultural equity can lie both at the systemic level, certainly with regard to policy, development of policy, whether field-wide or within an organization. Cultural equity can also certainly take place in decision-making of an individual, of management, of leadership, taking cultural equity best practices into account before making a decision can be critical to the development and design of any program or initiative. And then certainly the organizational, right? Many of you raised thumbs up, when I asked, do you have a plan? Another question I would ask is that plan aligned with your institutions or museums strategic plan, right? The general strategic plan. Is it aligned? Is it integrated? Sometimes institutions will create a cultural equity plan or diversity, equity, and inclusion plan over here, and then their institutional strategic plan is over here. So ideally, you want to align that in valuing how you value the work, how the work becomes sustainable within your institution. So I want to take a moment. I'd like to give, I know it's a lot of text, so I'm going to give you a minute per slide, just to kind of take in 3 examples. These are, and I will provide these as anonymous. 3 examples of museums' commitments and progress as it relates to cultural equity. This is example 1. So take a minute just to review this. Okay. Let's go to example 2. Okay, let's go to the last example. Okay. So I'd like to ask, how are we doing? Considering the three examples, what stood out for you? And what, in your opinion, is missing? Have been very correctly noting the importance of the a sustained commitment over a long term to the work of cultural equity in your institutions, organizations, and within our field. And this certainly is a critical insight and commitment to the work. So what I like to call sustained long-term commitment really is efforts to create impactful change, right? It's one thing, again, to say that to write or to say the change that we want to make. It's another to reflect that in the work that we're doing to advance that change. And then the question we must ask is this work having an impact on the goals that we set out for ourselves and the greater goals that we want the greater goals around change that we want to see within our arts and culture field. And so let me share screen. So one thing that we know, thanks to Raven Saunders just recently, held her wrists up and formed an X, and was asked, why she did so, and her response was she wanted to represent the intersection of where all people who are oppressed meet. And so impactful change happens when approaches and strategies to any change work, but certainly including cultural equity, focuses on the intersections of things. We talked about the importance and foundational considerations of racial equity within cultural equity work, but we also have to consider other dimensions of diversity as we understand the complexity of people, the complexity of historical compounding, inequities that we are grappling with and trying to work to undo and unravel and address. And so we must also consider, certainly in this work, power and positionality. We must also conduct preparation for our work that, first and foremost, as we've discussed, creates a thorough understanding of the issues, systems, and historical attempts to address the problem, both externally within the field, but also internally within our organizations. It's your organization's journey along this work. And then asking ourselves, do we have clarity of intentional action and testing? The three examples showed some good examples around clarity and intentional action, but we saw a lot of gaps, right? We saw a lot of things that we would have liked, that we would have liked more information on. And so how, as we move this work forward, can we understand the importance of these considerations, and then understand that as we do the work, change may not happen tomorrow, but the way that the change, that this change work happens is certainly is critical with regard to timing. So do we have timed responses, not reactions? A lot of critiques around organizations and institutions reacting to that moment, that critical moment that we found ourselves in 2020. So do we have timed responses? Have we been doing the work all along so that when opportunities like that moment in 2020 arise, we can both share the work that we've been doing and share either a renewed or expanded commitment to the work? And so all of these intersectional considerations are only make the work better, more sustainable, and certainly more impactful. So if we, when we talk about the intersections of this work, we also need to consider some of the intersecting intersecting critical issues that also come along side, if not intersect, cultural equity. So let's take a look at a few that are showing up very prominently for museums, and I would say the arts and culture field more widely at the moment. Last month, the LA Times published an article that shared the findings from Museums Moving Forward's report titled Workplace Equity and Organizational Culture in U.S. Art Museums. The study functions as a qualitative look at equity and workplace culture in museums, large and small, across the U.S. These were some of their findings. So 68% of art museums, this was just in September, so it's 2023, it's recent. 68% of art museum workers have considered leaving the field. 74% cannot always cover basic living expenses. It takes an average of 12 years before a worker receives a promotion. Turnover is high. Art museums lost 30% of full-time employees hired between 2020 and 2022, and rates were especially elevated among those making less than $50,000 a year. So those are some pretty stark statistics. And in my work, I have the privilege of coaching emerging museum workers that have just entered the field. And what was also shocking to learn was that in some cases, I found that these workers that function, that were in place across functional areas of the museum made less than I did when I entered museum work back in 1993. There's something not right about that. And certainly these numbers, I think, reflect those inequities. And we will continue to see labor and economic equity issues come up as a priority within change workspaces, within cultural equity conversations. Again, there are the objects and there are the people. And this is certainly an intersecting issue that has everything to do with the people that are caretakers for this work, are caretakers for the objects and the mission of the museum. So just a quote from the report from Mia Locks, who heads this Museums Moving Forward initiative. Simply put it, it's not enough to diversify the artists we are collecting or exhibiting. We must take better care of our people too. Ongoing union negotiations and social media outcries have made clear that the needs of workers are not being met. And so we will begin to see that it will become impossible to ignore if it's not so already. We have seen very public demonstrations of demands for more equitable income, salaries for workers, and a more collective approach to it. So whether it's at an entry-level position or middle management, you see more and more solidarity and collaboration with regard to seeking change in these areas. Collections. So we know that in the US and globally, that encyclopedic collections were formed within a colonial context of the late 1800s, right? And much of the critiques around museum collections stem from that origin. Though many US museums have made public commitments to diversity and inclusion goals, they are still a long way from achieving gender or racial equity in the art they buy and show, according to an exhaustive new data research project that journalists Charlotte Burns and Julia Halperin did for ArtNet News in 2020. an analysis of almost 350,000 works acquired and nearly 6,000 exhibitions staged at 31 museums across the US between 2008 and 2020 reveals how drastically underrepresented female identifying and Black American artists remain. One of the strategies or actions that have been undertaken recently to address this inequity can be seen at the Perez Art Museum in Miami. So in 2013, the Perez Art Museum developed an endowment fund for acquisitions of Black diaspora art with a $1 million gift from its founder and a matching gift from the Knight Foundation. This also invited other donor groups to organize and support exhibitions and programs featuring international women artists and Latin American and Latinx artists. So this is an intentional and strategic approach to closing the gap on that inequity with regard to representation of BIPOC artists and exhibitions within institutions. It is actually taking resources, organizing and fundraising resources in order to close that gap. So it's working within existing systems through funding efforts to further diversify what is seen at the Perez Art Museum. The other area that intersects cultural equity, or the other consideration that intersects cultural equity, is the fact that many museums oftentimes seek partnerships with regard to its work, whether in its arts education or public programming efforts, curatorial departments, to audience development and fundraising. Museums and institutions are often seeking partnerships within communities near and far. And so we have to ask ourselves, what makes a healthy community partner? How might, in our efforts to advance cultural equity, how might we engage more healthily in partnerships than what institutions and museums have done in the past, which, have not been so healthy and great and equitable and mutually beneficial. So questions to ask, what is the value in getting proximate to those we want to serve or those we want to partner with? Are we aware of and do we value existing leadership in communities we want to work with, right? The idea that we're not bringing anything to anyone. There's oftentimes something already existing. There is certainly a community leadership already in place. So are we aware of that, and are we approaching partnerships with that knowledge in hand? Do we see community and community leaders as equal partners in our strategies? We've heard and we have seen larger institutions and museums go into communities and propose what might be qualified as inequitable partnerships, right? Where they're getting a lot, but what is the exchange? How is this effort? How is this partnership? How is this relationship mutually beneficial? Not just for a limited amount of time, but how are we building sustainable partnerships? And then, do you see the value of including diverse persons in your planning from the very start? In other words, not just bringing in, right, community partners or partners at the tail end, right, as you develop your marketing or as you develop your promotional strategies, but from the very beginning of the concept of the exhibition, the program, et cetera, et cetera. Are we bringing folks as thought partners along from the very beginning? And how, again, in each of these points, how are we sustaining? How are we imagining a sustained relationship? So healthy community partnerships take into account not just cultural equity, but certainly other equity lanes. And I would add in there cultural humility and interculturality. And cultural humility really is just an interpersonal stance that is other oriented, all right, or open to the other person in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to them. Cultural humility is different from all other culturally based trainings and ideals because it focuses on self-humility rather than being rather than being uh, rather than othering someone in order to advance your goals around diversity. So do we understand that in partnerships, we do not want to ask anyone to conform to our processes and systems, but we want to meet in the middle. We want to understand. We want to know that there is value existing and that we are coming together for mutually beneficial purposes and equitable exchanges. Interculturality refers to the existence and equitable interaction of diverse cultures and the possibility of generating shared cultural expressions through dialogue and mutual respect. That's from UNESCO. Interculturality operates within underlying social paradigms of inequality, difference, and diversity. So again, going back to, do we understand the power and privilege that we have as a representative of an institution or museum entering into exploring a partnership or a relationship with a group or individual that may have historically experienced inequity, difference, and oppression, right? The power dynamics. Are we aware and are we sensitive to that as we move into partnerships? Whether at a community level or institution to organization level. And so I would say that this partnership, this relationship building is very critical to the greater arts and culture, how we shift, right? The dynamics of inequity and power and privilege at a field level, whether it's local or national, depending on your mission. So again, all three of these are critical intersections to the work, to much of the work, cultural equity work, the DEI work, the DEAI work, the JEDI work that your organizations and institutions are.
Thanks so much, Yvonne. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you made it through all three sessions, thank you so much. All three sessions will be on our YouTube channel for you all to watch and look back at. And if you'd like to join us for more Centering Equity programming, you can just go onto CAM's website, calmuseums.org/Centering Equity, and there is a whole list of things that will be coming up over the next few years. Thank you guys again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day.